Peru is home to the second largest Japanese diaspora, second to Brazil's. Although they represent less than 1% of Peru's population, the Nikkei people, non-resident descendants, have had an extensive cultural reach since their arrival in the South American continent. The late 19th century saw the first wave of Japanese immigrants enter Peruvian soil as Japan had begun to expand their diplomatic effort. This first wave was sent by the Japanese government to provide workers who would mostly occupy plantations. The community rapidly grew and established itself through ownership of many small businesses that scaled as the years progressed. When Japan became involved in World War II, there was a huge international pushback against Japanese communities outside of Japan. The Nikkei people had already been getting pushback since the 1940s as they fueled jealousy from other Peruvians for their success in establishing themselves on the socio-economic ladder. In 1941, Nikkei families like the one of Blanca Katsura and Checo Kamisato were deported to the United States after the American government ordered them to do so. This was not a hard decision for Peruvian public opinion, which obviously swayed in disfavor of the Nikkei. Katsura and Kamisato, along with 1,800 Japanese immigrants from Peru, were imprisoned for the entirety of the war in conditions that Kamisato deems comparable to Nazi prisoner camps at the time. Ayumi Takenaka, a scholar who has extensively researched many aspects of the diaspora, deems Latin American racial structures and the insistence on keeping a dynamic of the other as the main reason for earlier struggles. Like it is posed by Franklin Knight, a particular discourse was pushed when European colonizers wanted to implement slavery, which led to an extremely racialized society that still prevails today. This made countries like Peru extremely focused on race and ethnicity, which in turn can explain the outcast of the Nikkei people who demonstrate a visible difference. Another reason for why this alienation that struck upon the Japanese diaspora could perhaps be the homogeneous nature of Japanese culture and the institutional reluctance of straying away from core culture, values that could have been brought through Japanese schooling in Nikkei communities. Scholars like Yamasaki touch on this by explaining that part of the Japanese-Peruvian schooling system have recently made an effort to help young Nikkei unlearn some of the values that ancestral Japanese education instills in order to facilitate their immersion in Peruvian culture. What is interesting about the case of the Nikkei in Peru is that although they remain quite an outsider community, the subculture that they have developed has also pulled them away from their Japanese roots. This is relevant because Japan signed a bill in 1989 that would allow Nikkei people to migrate back to their ancestral homeland. This, however, proved unsuccessful due to gaps in cultural behavior such as language, but also interestingly on a socio-economic level. Japan expected to receive industrial and agricultural workers, but the pool of Nikkei that went back proved to be much more skilled and higher up on the economic ladder, which sparked competition that Japan did not necessarily need. This reflects how well the Nikkei established themselves in Peru in terms of their socio-economic standing, despite being an immigrant minority group, which can also explain the discrimination surrounding them in earlier public opinion. Lastly, the Nikkei's perhaps most renowned impact on culture is the fusion of food that arose from Japanese immigrants attempting to maintain their culinary practices while using local Peruvian ingredients. Consisting of raw seafood preparations and Peruvian spices, this cuisine spreads as over 45% of Japanese immigrants were involved in the Peruvian restaurant industry by the year 1930. What is interesting about Nikkei food is that it has become a national pride and is appropriated by all Peruvians who pride themselves in it. Ayumi Takenaka argues that the success that this cuisine has picked up over the years represent a strong foundation for their cultural identity and also demonstrates the shift that they have experienced from an integration standpoint when looking back at the treatment they received 70 years ago. By maintaining an emphasis on the fusion aspect of Nikkei cuisine, there's a claim for the successful immersion of Japanese immigrants in Peru while maintaining pride and differentiation through their ancestral culture.